Morning. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much to St. Luke's for involving, and the Arts Committee for involving me in this process of exploring and kind of a holy pondering of these icons and what you were looking for your community. And I want to also thank them for this yesterday and the rest of today for hosting my partner Abby and I, and also Abby's parents, Bill and Jane. So thank you so much. So I want to start too, just briefly, just to tell you a little bit about my story, just for a little bit of context and how I got started doing iconography. My partner Abby and I currently live in St. Louis, but my father is a pastor. I'm a PK. I grew up near Chicago in Aurora, Illinois, and that's where my father serves at a church for 20 years, and that's where I grew up, was in near Chicago, Illinois. So I've always been making art. I was one of those kids during the service to draw all over the bulletins, and that was kind of my thing, kind of tuning out church, to be honest, just drawing the whole time. But after high school, I ended up going to Greenville, Illinois. There's a college there called Greenville University. And I went there for music, and was a very poor music student. And I ended up talking to my mentor, Rick, and I said, I don't really know what to do. And he said, well, just take any classes that you want to take, and then come back to you to the next semester, and we can kind of regroup. And I ended up taking, without realizing it, all religion classes and all art classes, which ended up working perfectly later, doing iconography. But later, after school, I ended up, this is kind of where my story and iconography intersect. I ended up going and living with a community after school, following a friend to Athens, Ohio. There's a community there called the Common Friars, which unfortunately is no longer, but it was connected through the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. And the group, it was single people, priests, couples, and our common work was centered around a food pantry farm where we grew produce for food pantries. And while living and working there, I was making art, and one of the priests who lives with us, Father Tom, one day asked me, have you ever done iconography? And I hadn't. I knew what it was. I had kind of a basic understanding, but that set me on a path of really trying to see if icons were something that I'd want to paint or want to do. And so I started combing through books, and you can show the first slide if you want. Combing through books and looking at all of these old iconography images. And what I ended up doing is what all iconographers do, but artists alike, is I just started tracing. And tracing the images, putting tracing paper, and this is one of the most famous icons in the world. It's called Rublev's Trinity icon. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. But really, going through these images, the old iconographers used to have trained under apprentice. And what iconography was doing, specifically in the Eastern Church, and I am no theologian, I'm an artist, and I'm sure Robert, if you have more questions on the separation of the Eastern Western Church, I'm definitely not the person to ask. But as the Western Church embraced stained glass windows as a way for the many people that were coming in who were illiterate, they didn't know how to read. And the artwork in churches was sometimes the only way that they had for understanding what was going on in a service. And so the Eastern Church really, instead of stained glass windows and some of the artwork at that time in the Western Church, really embraced iconography. That this was a physical representation of the Trinity in a piece, or Christ as the Good Shepherd, or Christ as the teacher. And so for the Eastern Church, Rublev's icon and his interpretation of the Trinity, he was taking, which is what all icons doing, and what Father Robert mentioned this morning, taking symbol. And what symbol is really just where two things come together, where a symbol or image and meaning come together. And in the Latin art is where two things come together properly in such a proper way where they're made beautiful. So that's really what icons are trying to do, is they're trying to take all these symbols and the meaning and the scriptures and put them together in such a proper image that it's beautiful, and it becomes an incarnation of that saint or person. And so Rublev, the story that he took, that he came up with, and other artists had tried it, but this is considered the most beautiful, was the story of Abraham and Sarah entertaining the three guests and the angels and having them sit around a table, and it's a communion of the three, of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, communing around a table with wine, and the mountain above the first angel, the tree, and then the temple, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But these symbols all coming together to create something that when the person looks at it, and if they didn't even know how to read, they know what's going on. So that's how I entered into learning some of these basic constructs of iconography. But as I was interacting with the old icons, I didn't train under an iconographer, but as an artist, I was so struck by it that I started to want to try to interact with my community and the things that we were doing as a community, farming, and interact those and intersect them with iconography. And so the first original icon that I did was this next slide called Christ Consider the Lilies. My best friend Paul would say, as we're farming and we're tending the earth and wanting to care for people in our community and earth, how do we be people like Jesus who we consider the lilies of the field? I think I've gotten a lot better since this icon was painted. A Franciscan monk loves this painting because he says that it looks like Jesus is almost surprised that the lilies are in his hand a little bit with how I painted it. But what was beautiful and what this icon, this first icon that I did, was that my community embraced it because it was a part of our common experience. And this is the part of iconography that I very much connect to and was really excited when St. Luke's approached me for the Transfiguration, the Pentecost. Is that how do we take these older traditions and the metaphors and the older works of iconography, like Rublev's icon you just saw, and carry it into the present, where we can see these common metaphors that we have around us of people, the oppressed, the poor, the least of these that are among us here and now, and that are here right in front of us, and use the tradition of iconography and intersect those two. And so one of the first icons that I had that opportunity to work with some of these metaphors was a new icon of the Trinity. Or was the Transfiguration. Is this? I wanted to show you this first. So as I was working through these metaphors, this is one of the first older icons that I got to do, and this is actually the first version of the Transfiguration that I did back in 2014, and was still working through and tracing over the older icons of Eastern iconography. But this is for a community in Glendale, Ohio, of sisters in the Episcopal Church, the community of the Transfiguration. And then you can do the next slide. But again, this is the Trinity. So Rublev's painted, I think, around 1,000. It was around 1,000. And then the modern icon that was commissioned by a priest in New York City. In this icon was a collaboration with Father Mark Bizzuti Jones, and it was really trying to carry the Rublev icon into our time in understanding that the conversations in the church, and this was a part of our conversation with St. Luke's, the Pentecost icon and the Transfiguration icon. This really is, in our time, having a lot of conversations about representation of our art in our churches, that God's people are made up of everyone, all walks of life, and who they are. And so Mark Bizzuti Jones thought, how do we depict the Trinity way where it's diverse, with a woman of color, another woman maybe of Eastern descent, and a person of Asian descent, but all women, understanding that women, how much the feminine characteristics of God are vital for us understanding our spirituality and as Christians, that by making the grapes and wheat instead of the cup, that for Mark that was symbolizing not bread in its final state, or wine in its final state, but grapes and wheat, that there's still work that we have to do to as communities to create the body of Christ and create living lives of love in our world. And then again, the symbols, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, and God, the mountain above above the figure on the right, really representing the wilderness, the spirit, the breath, the wild nature of God. The tree representing also Christ and the cross. And then the temple, the temple of God, the holiness of God. These kind of symbols, intersecting them, and then again around the table, and this time holding hands. And then the figure at the left extending a hand, almost inviting the viewer in to have a seat at the table, have a seat among the Trinity, that we are involved in this work and active in the work of God in this world. So again, these are the types of symbols that, though subtle, can speak volumes in how the early iconographers do it, but is also the hope that I have in the work that I'm currently doing with these icons. And you can do the next slide, more of a close-up of that. And so, as I started doing some of these commissions, it was kind of a millennial side hustle for a while, and doing this on the side. This next icon, though, was one where, you can do the next slide. I was really having a lot of people from different churches. They had seen, in Ohio, they'd seen something on the wall and asked me to paint something of St. Michael for their son Michael, or St. Peter for a small parish that was in Ohio. And I really love the communal aspect of icons and being able to engage with communities like yourself. But early in our travels, Eddie and I had met a young immigrant man around from a bonfire, and hearing his stories, how he had been a refugee and fleeing his country and crossing the desert, his hopes and his fears. Being in America was really, it really broke us. And hearing his story, and at the time in 2016, there's a lot of rhetoric around anti-immigrants and anti-refugees, really wanting to interact with that. And my partner Evie and I had a lot of conversations where how can we, again, carry the metaphors and these images that have come from the past, from iconography and from sacred art, and carry them to the present in such a way where we could really do what all art can potentially do, which is to create dialogue within ourselves, but also in our community in sharing this work. And so we ended up calling this La Sacreda Familia, the sacred family, where it is a modern depiction of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, that as they fled Herod, they were refugees 2,000 years ago, that their experience then was the same experience the refugees across the world, and now in Ukraine, but also fleeing countries in South America and across the world are experiencing today. And so bringing those two things together in a proper way that hopefully is beautiful. And people really responded to this image, both positively and negatively. But I think what happened is it was doing exactly what I hoped that the work could do, which is create these conversations. That our church art maybe isn't necessarily glorified wallpaper, but actually says something about us and helps us see things in a new way. And this was really seeing how this icon was accepted. We are very good friends with some Franciscans in Santa Barbara, and they would regularly hold services for immigrant families in the community, and hearing families coming forward after seeing this icon and touching it. Like, there's both the people who deeply experienced the pain of having to flee, and refugees also receiving this icon has been something that was unexpected, but I think really important. And I'm not the only one doing this work, but this was really what led me into wanting to do full-time iconography and where I am today. But these kind of intersections of the least of these and these common metaphors were exactly the kind of work that I wanted to do. So we can go to the next slide. Which led us to other things that was seeing around me in these modern symbols. This is called the Holy Family of the streets. That again, seeing the Holy Family had to flee, was homeless in a sense, fleeing. And when I lived in Chicago, and Evie, some of her work, and never interacting with a lot of families just like this in the city that were displaced for various reasons, but that really this was also the journey of the Holy Family. So again, taking these drawing from the old metaphors and the old artwork, but then bringing it to the present. You can do the next one as well. So in that sense, as we're working through, as St. Luke's and I were having conversations specifically about Pentecost, was really, and we'll show some slides in a second, but really involving, as Robert said today, the communion of saints and the communion of that we are all called to be priests. This icon was called Selma. It was actually commissioned by a Methodist pastor whose father crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Martin Luther King Jr. and the many, John Lewis and Rosa Parks and the many others who are depicted in this painting, that this modern work that prophets are still among us here and now, and they aren't just have happened 2,000 years ago, that there's people and saints, and in the Episcopal Church, Martin Luther King Jr. is a saint, but that there are people living among us here and now that have something to teach us about who God is and how we can also live lives more fighting against injustice and living lives of peace and compassion. And so really this was a modern icon really showing that communion of saints for something that happened not too long ago. But really that this is work that we can all do. Which leads us to the Pentecost, which was what the Arts Committee and Father Robert was a lot of our conversations involving that metaphor. And the Pentecost, as Father Robert shared this morning, is just a beautiful image that across time and across, no matter who you are, your orientation, as you said beautifully, Robert, no matter as your skin color, your job, your intellect, any of this, that we're all welcome at the table. And the symbols of the icon on your right is very much an older icon. It's about 200 years old, 100 years old. Again, the flames, the fire coming down, the Mary being at the center now that Christ is gone, receiving the Holy Spirit and the disciples sitting around. But again, Jesus kind of in the background, tucked. It looked like a table, so why not maybe include a table instead where all these different people are sitting around in different ways. And so this icon was very much an inspiration to, instead of Mary sitting on a throne, maybe having her just as one of the many people that are sitting at the table, that we're all in the same place and in the same, looking across from one another, and all are welcome. We can do the next slide. And then again with the Transfiguration, the newest one I've done now, the second version, was really much drawn from this very old icon to your left, where the disciples' sandals are breaking off as they're completely stunned by the Christ glowing. And in a lot of iconography, and we can talk more about more symbols, in classic iconography, blue is the symbol of the colors have so much meaning as well. Blue is divinity, has always been about divinity. So when you see these old icons of Jesus, he's wearing a blue sash and typically a red shirt, which symbolizes his divinity and his humanity, blood and humanity. But again, with this work, and I'm so grateful that for St. Luke's and our time and having these conversations, that, I mean, in our world, we are constantly inundated with images, whether it's advertisements, social media. When we were driving here from St. Louis, I mean, some of the McDonald's towers are bigger than your steeple here. I mean, they're constantly seeing these things. So for me, and again, I'm not the only one doing this work, but I think what sacred art can do, and I hope that these icons can do for your community and in our time, is really teach us how to see. Not only see each other in a new way, see the least of these among us, that if you're looking for Christ in your neighborhood in Salisbury, go walk around your town and you'll probably find him. But these very images of Christ have something to show us about who we are and who God is. And that we can learn how to observe. And hopefully these images, the Transfiguration, the Pentecost, will continue to teach your community how to see one another and see God. So thank you again, and I hope that this gave you a little bit more insight into my work and the work that I hope to create. So thank you. Yeah. Is there any questions?
So we intentionally left time for plenty of questions, so please don't be shy. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand. Kelly will repeat the question so that everyone can make sure that they hear it. But yeah, so let them know what questions you've got about this.
Kelly, when you're considering a new icon, I know you use old icons. Do you use inspiration from artwork, other media?
Yeah, I do. So a lot of the icons so could you go back to La Sacred Familia maybe? So La Sacred Familia, in creating of this icon, I think a lot of the work, especially the modern works, really comes from looking at a paper or a magazine and seeing an image, maybe on accident or purposely looking for it, that really strikes me, or in this case really struck Evie and I, in a way that that just a particular face or person really encapsulates the image. And so for here, this was specifically the mother and child was a version that was an image that had been circulating around, and we obviously changed a few things. But definitely work like that, magazines and things that we're seeing in the news are really trying to take those and collage them in a new way, that we're, again, using some of these old metaphors and symbols and having them be fleeing at night instead, and adding the stars and the moon. It kind of get that sense of the same thing that Joseph, Jesus, and Mary had to do, fleeing in the middle of the night for their very lives. And the people are continuing to do this. So hopefully that answers your question. The other artwork as well, I mean, portraiture, very much interested in all of these artists who, other iconographers, which I can go through, and their work is Brother Robert Lenz, who's a Franciscan iconographer, Mark Dukes, who's an iconographer who now lives in Thailand, and so many others that are doing really incredible work is also really inspiring.
My question is a little funny. Are there any projects that you have rejected?
Oh.
And if not, are there some that you think you would consider that if anyone asks you, you might say no?
Yeah, one saint that I've always had a problem with, and I think this goes in with Robert's sermon again, sorry to keep referencing your sermon, but I'm sure you don't mind, was Joan of Arc. I've had many people ask me to do Joan of Arc, and I think it's such a complicated character in the history of the church, God telling her to go at war isn't something that I particularly believe in. And so that is a saint that many people have asked me to do, and I've been very uneasy with it. So that's been a hard one. I think at certain images, I have had to politely say no, and some of them I can't frankly. There was one time a very good-natured person wanted to do a depiction of martyrs in the Colosseum, and the lions had halos on, and I didn't really quite know what they were saying, which is, I mean, just thinking about it now, it's kind of very odd, but I had to politely say no. So there are some of those very interesting images and that people want, but majority of the time, what's really beautiful about this work is some of these initial conversations that do go well, where, for instance, I did a work of Francis sitting around a fire with novices, and when that call came from the Franciscan friar named Jeff, who's now a very good friend, that first interaction where he was we were talking on the phone and describing the image and what he wanted and what their community was talking about, and just that image immediately sinking into my head. I knew exactly, we both connected exactly, and then showing him and him just like bursting into tears was the most humbling thing because we both connected and had that image. And so there is the both and there is the hard ones, but then it's the ones when you really connect and the image is there. It's really beautiful to experience with people.
On your first paint, your first icon, I was wondering what the symbolic meaning of the owl is.
Oh, sorry. Or it's actually it's a house sparrow. It's the most common sparrow in the world. And this part of, in Christ, in the Beatitudes, where Christ saying, talking about even the sparrows are taken care of, and the flowers and their beauty are taken care of by God. And so I am a bird lover, and so adding the sparrow to that with a little halo was almost my nod to the Beatitudes in that sense, and Christ's words.
What is the Greek letters?
Yes, I was hoping someone might ask that because I forgot to mention. So really, the in a lot of iconography, both with Christ and specifically with Mary. So you'll see on the bottom here, this is the early iconographers. The Greek of Jesus Christ is quite long, and they wanted to figure out, okay, I don't want to paint all of these letters. How can we just like kind of condense this a little bit? So what they ended up doing is taking the first letter and the last letter of Jesus and of Christ, so it became IC. So whenever you see this by an icon, you know that that's the iconographer saying that's Jesus. For Mary, that's MP, and it's, I don't know how to say the Greek letter, rho, and then Y, and Mary's. But then around the halo, you'll see the crucifix, but the Greek letters there symbolize I am who I am, or I am the one who exists, kind of hearkening back to the burning bush and Moses and God's work. But typically Christ is depicted with that letter, I am who I am, within his halo in the cruciform nature. Yeah, good question.
Have you ever done the prodigal son?
I haven't done the prodigal son, but I'd love to.
You need to hear Robert's sermon recently of the prodigal son.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I know there's certain stories like that where some of the old masters like Raphael or Rembrandt have done that. You think, I don't know how you could do it better, but I'd be willing to try.
Have you seen the
I haven't, no. I haven't seen the original. She has, yeah. No. Any other questions?
You said at one time you had studied iconography, but you clearly do study iconography. Do you have a teacher now, or do you just learn out in the world?
Yeah, I think my mentor, my mentor Rick McPeak, who was when I was at college and ended up taking religion and art, he always used to like to say that being an artist is like being born blind but given sight. And I think that's how it's been. I was just using what I had at the time, and when I was living as a farmer, you know, didn't have all the materials with me, but I still wanted to learn. I wanted to do the work, and luckily, as time's now 10 years going on, and especially during the pandemic, I had the honor of Zooming with several iconographers, which was an honor, and just learning from them. It is really about becoming a better painter, and hopefully continue to do that the rest of my life. But
There's so much symbolism, though, like those
Yeah.
fingers, that means something.
right, no, and I think it does. I mean, for me, that some of it was copying some of the old metaphors that you see, and then later you learn that means something. That means, you know, for the early iconographers, again in the Trinity icon, the symbols of the temple and the tree and the mountain. It was right in the middle of the icon, we were like, wait a second, what am I painting? What does this mean? And then you go back and you learn, and it's really gratifying to kind of know that there's a lot of thought in that. And so even some of the colors in, say, with Sacred of Familia, again, the little boy being carried is supposed to symbolize Christ, or even the little boy in the next painting. Instead of having, you know, where Jesus is wearing a robe, the little boy is wearing a little, of the same colors of Christ, the blue, the divinity, and then the red. But instead of it being a biblical robe, it's a little snow onesie. Yeah.
Since I know I have the images
Yeah.
on here, do you want to talk to some about the process?
Yeah, no, I would. So this is kind of, I sent Robert just a few of the process images, and so with iconography, typically it's all, as you know, and as the very large paintings that, I should say, I would like to thank, there's a few of the gentlemen that yesterday, and Robert, putting up the icon. I think we should just give them a hand. I don't know if everyone knows what we went through yesterday to get those up on the wall. It was quite the process, but this was on a wood board that a friend of mine made, and all the icons I do are on wood. And typically, in iconography, you're going to move, and this is a theological part of it, is that you're going to move from dark to light. That you're moving from a darkness to light. And so for me, I'm starting with a white background, and typically we'll trace the figures right on the board, or in our case, we did several sketches with the arts committee and finalized them, and then I took those and then transferred them onto the board. You can go to the next one. So really blocking out the dark colors and the rays and where the silver leaf on the Transfiguration icon was going to be, and the silver leaf, typically the Christ first in this case. You can go to the next one. There's kind of more of a glimmering version of it. But yeah, blocking out colors, and then really just for each person moving from the darkness to the light, that kind of the theological nature of it. And then again, just blocking out where with some painter's tape, where the rays were going to look the best for the piece, and where the rest of the silver leaf would eventually be placed in there. So, and then again, now that it's blocked out, adding the background, and then later, as you can see in the final version, adding the called the lance, right? The lance shape on top. Yeah.
My question, I'm concerned, the icon that was dedicated today looks so pretty and presentable. How long have you been doing this work? Because it's very unique.
So the first icon, thank you for asking. How long have I done this work, as she asked?
Yeah.
I started the first icon of Christ, the Lilies, I started in 2010, so I guess that's been 12 years that I've been doing it. And again, yeah, just learning to become a better painter, and it takes a long time. 12 years, yeah. Rich?
Is it more challenging to project what you finally have in your mind if it's a group of people as opposed to a single saint?
Yeah, Reg asked if it's harder to depict many people than it is just one single saint, and the very quick answer is yes. I think even though with Pentecost, we really came up with the image through the draft and drafting out certain colors. As you're putting color down, you notice some other part of an individual, I'm going to change that. So I typically, especially these larger images, I'd say when we show sketches, maybe 75% of it will still be in the icon in some form, but I might change the rest of it, and just as the process continues. And I didn't know I was gonna, give the woman in front a green dress, but that color went perfectly with the person next to him that I painted with, a red flannel on. So, there's just those kind of artistic decisions too that kind of come about. But with one saint, when you're focusing on them, that is much easier to kind of, again, get all the metaphors and fit everything in there. It's a little easier to fit in one image. I don't know if that answered your question. Anyone else?
How long did it take you from start to finish on each one?
Okay, so the Transfiguration, I flew through. I think it took me 2 weeks to do that one, and then the Pentecost took me, I think it was a month, so it was a little bit longer. So, and because there's so many people in it. But again, the other aspect is gilding takes a long time. So the gilding is, many people probably know, but when you're doing leaf work, so whether it's silver leaf or gold leaf, and so there's so many people in this icon, it took a long time to get that down. And and write. It's a process.
Is that acrylic or is that oil?
So it's two things. There's it's acrylic or gouache. So there's a acrylic, which is kind of like a plastic medium, but it holds a lot of pigment. And then the other material I use is called flash, which is rather new, but it's made with vinyl, but it has a lot of pigment in it, and it's a kind of a really cool. I don't want to go on an artist nerd rant, but it used to be used for these. It's a specific paint they used in France for opera backdrops because it has so much pigment in it, but it's vinyl. And so I found that works really well for certain colors where it really becomes really vibrant. So like the woman in front in the blue of the nurse or doctor here, and the red there and the sash. And again, trying to remember Pentecost that the red is the color with the priest on the left there. Some of those colors are that flash. It's really dense and makes it really vibrant. So.
We had a chance to look at the icon that belongs to St. Luke's in the chapel.
So she's asking me about the icon in the chapel. Another gentleman, I'm sorry, yes, told me, I was going to ask Father Robert to show me the icon in the chapel, but I've heard it's quite beautiful. Yeah. I don't know too much about it yet, but I look forward to seeing it. Is there one?
Is there a particular wood that you use?
Yeah, so she's asking about the wood. Typically what the iconographers would do, and there's two types that you take, there's many different woods, cedar, everything from that to birch is what I use typically because it's so warp resistant. But a lot of the traditional icons, they would have a wood, but then they would take rabbit glue and dip canvas in it, and then dip this in glue and then wrap it around a wood and shape it and protect the wood. And then they would gesso it, so they would take white wash paint and fill in the gaps. And they would do that 7 times and then sand it down as smooth as a baby's cheek. A lot of the iconographers now don't have rabbit glue readily available. And so that whole process has been kind of modernized in the sense where you are still covering it with paint and sanding it down. So both these icons we gessoed down several times, and then I would sand them down until they're very smooth so the paint goes on really nicely. But yeah.
It seems like you have given some symbols within these beautiful pieces that are particular for us, for our congregation and our mission. Particularly the arches that you have created to see within the windows, the arches there. And also the symbol with our was a cross there in the sky. Can you talk a little bit about that makes it unique for us?
Absolutely. So what was can be a fun part with the sketches. So when I had originally had an original conversation and of the arts committee and Robert to thank for this, with these icons and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the other iconographer who did the 2 beautiful pieces also. Suzanne Schleck also incorporated the arches in there, that wanting to have the icons, be in their own right beautiful, but also incorporate some of the architecture and some of the imagery, and as you said, the symbols of St. Luke's. And so after I did some of the original sketches, we added some of that symbolism. So instead adding that little cross symbol and the stars there, yeah. And again, and adding a few of the things that I didn't know your chalice actually was silver, which ended up working out for the chalice on the table, and so things like that as well. Anyone else?